Mobility weapons are suffering in Splatoon 3 and have been for a while. This is a big problem for the meta, and here's why. First, let me explain what I mean by mobility weapon because it's not a concrete category that 100% of people will agree on. Mobility weapons are aggro weapons which have some type of extra movement ability which its playstyle and positioning revolves around. Keep in mind though that categorizing weapons will always be an imperfect system since it's quite subjective, plus weapon strengths and weaknesses are on a spectrum relative to the strengths and weaknesses of weapons around them which change with patches. So here's some examples of mobility weapons. We've got Ink Brush with its fast roll and built-in ink resistance, Wiper with its high strafe speed being excellent at painting for itself, plus it's got a little bit of a dash slash as a bonus. Sploosh is lightweight with the ability to quickly paint itself into enemy ink, either with its main weapon or curling bomb, and then most dualies, with their rolls giving them a variety of movement options. Mobility weapons are centered around team play because of their self-sufficiency. Basically, a mobility weapon doesn't need to spend resources to get itself in or break past their team's line of control in the same way as other weapons. Their mobility is enough on its own to do that, because it allows them to survive precarious situations. So this lets the mobility weapon open up space for their team by doing things like pulling aggro away from locations they want to take, which might otherwise require spending a special to clear. Or they might break the enemy's line of defense by flanking and taking out their backline, which they're able to do because they're not affected by fighting an enemy ink as much. Or maybe they cause an enemy resource to be wasted because they've gotten themselves into a position that the enemy needs cleared before they can comfortably move forwards. They're also great at setting up 2v1s, where the mobility weapon starts a fight and draws it out with its mobility long enough that another weapon could join in. These are just a few examples, and while non-mobility weapons may be able to pull off the same things in some circumstances, the risk that they would be taking is higher than mobility weapons would be for the same reward. Outside of their mobility, the risk tends to be lower because the lives of mobility weapons are less valuable. Now, that's not me trying to be mean. When you die in Splatoon, you lose not only the resource of your life, but you also lose the time that it takes to respawn, the space that you might have controlled with that time, and your special charge. So unless a death results in the enemy team also losing significant resources to make it worth it, losing a player often has a greater negative effect on your team than losing another resource like maybe a poorly used special might. Another reason their lives are less valuable is that when a team chooses to run a mobility weapon, they also usually include at least one other aggro weapon in their comp, which means that when one of them dies, they aren't losing all of their aggressive pressure, so their game plan doesn't completely fall apart, in comparison to losing, say, your backline, which you would normally only run one of, and provides a large amount of very specific utility to a team that other weapons can't fully emulate. That life is way more valuable than a mobility weapons. Many mobility weapons also don't have a lot of gear dependency, which enables them to run a lot of QR, which lowers the time that they're taken out of the match when they do die, as well as often having specials that are more selfish than team-oriented, so it doesn't hurt the rest of the team as much if they die before using their special. Plus, those selfish specials often help them stay alive longer. So all of these factors lower the value of a mobility weapon's life, making it more statistically advantageous to make riskier plays. Since mobility weapons have all of these theoretical advantages, they and traditional aggros are balanced in kinda opposite ways. A mobility weapon will have, well, high mobility, but a slower kill time to compensate, while weapons with faster kill times will have less mobility. Other factors that might be balanced around are ink efficiency and range, but those are much more weapon to weapon than something you could generalize to aggro weapons as a whole. So mobility weapons win their fights versus other aggros by relying on their movement to basically decrease the enemy's kill time by doing things like making them miss, or getting initiative in the fight, or hitting them from a position the enemy can't quickly or easily retaliate against, or stalling until a teammate can help. And all of those factors lead me to why mobility weapons have been worse, basically increasingly throughout S3's lifetime. Just from the get-go, Splatoon 3's maps, especially at launch, put mobility weapons in a rough spot. Your mobility doesn't mean much if there's no flanks for you to take, or weird spots to pull aggro to, or just, in general, space to move around. I was a dually Squelchers main when S3 came out, and I remember consistently seeing Squelchers overrated in tier lists for like a year because they had been good in S2, and people didn't yet realize how much the map design affected their viability. My favorite maps as a dually player are ones that have sides for you to play from, like Ramen, Mako Mart, Hagglefish, and I mean, honestly, those are like the only ones that have notable side angles. Sturgeon is pretty funny too, but it's not really on comp map lists, so. Even despite the maps, we still saw some Tetras, Wipers, and dually Squelchers early on. The first time after launch that we saw a decrease in mobility weapons was when Cooler became meta for the first time, because Cooler practically allows any aggro weapon to do what a mobility weapon wants to do. Cooler gives every weapon a butt ton of swim speed, run speed, ink resistance, and quick super jump, allowing them to move faster, take riskier positions, and respect enemy ink less. It also gives max QR and special saver, so their death is even less impactful than what a mobility weapon could possibly fit in a gear build. And that's without the caveats of normal QR only activating when you die without getting a kill, and other aggros being likely to have a stronger special than mobility weapons. So Cooler becoming a staple in the meta quickly decreased the value of running a mobility weapon, and instead teams opted to just run weapons with stronger fighting capabilities, since their normal drawbacks had been mitigated, and Cooler really encourages main weapon fights. If you're better at getting kills, you benefit from it more. The increased mobility also makes mobility weapons matchups less favorable favorable into other aggros because their speeds are more even, and Cooler is really good for a lot of weapons that mobility weapons already had a hard time fighting, making the most common matchups that you see your worst ones. More recently, main weapon power has been extremely high, but only for the chosen few. At most levels of play you can make anything work, but the higher up you go competitively, pretty much anything being run has a 1 or 2 shot kill time, with the notable exceptions being run as supports. So what happens to mobility weapons who have lower kill times than other aggros and bad matchups? They get sentenced to support jail. Now take the term support with a huge grain of salt because roles don't exist in Splatoon the way that they do in other comp games, but the most notable mobility weapons that you'll see in comp lately are splat dualies and vanilla dapple dualies because they have decent paint and kits that provide a lot of team utility, causing them to be the most supportive weapon on many team comps. They might be picked over traditional supports because they can keep up a bit easier with fast-paced, fight-heavy matches, but they're not really encouraged to play around their mobility in the way you'd normally want to, because their lives suddenly gain a lot of value when they're responsible for providing their team with paint and special support. Playing V-Dually genuinely feels like trying to run around with ankle weights on sometimes, I swear. And I'm gonna be real, I think the 11.0 update was the final nail in the coffin. 11.0 introduced 2 changes that I think disproportionately affect mobility weapons negatively. First, the way hitboxes work changed. Basically, swim form became harder to hit, and kid form became easier to hit. And guess what type of weapon spends more time than anybody else fighting in kid form? That's right, it's mobility weapons! Plus, since the swim and kid hitboxes are now notably different than each other, weapons that fight with shot strafing, which switches you between forms, have their hitboxes mixed up every time they switch, so tracking them is harder than before, while mobility weapons tend not to shot strafe as often. Sploosh is probably fine with it though. And I think the second one might be a bit more controversial, but I think that Flow Aura benefits non-mobility aggros significantly more than mobility weapons, further raising their power levels while mobility weapons kinda stay the same. Aura gives you 3 mains worth of run speed, swim speed, increz, and intensify action. Plus, it puts ink down around you when it activates or with subsequent splats. And what did we say earlier that high kill power weapons are balanced around? That's right, it's their mobility! So now weapons that are supposed to have a harder time breaking out of their line of control can get away with way more stuff than before, similar to what happens with Cooler. Plus, they're often weapons that are likely to have more chances to proc Aura anyways. There are plenty of fights that I participate in as a mobility weapon where I never land a single shot on the guy that I'm engaging with, because I'm just there to make them turn their back on my teammate who's about to stab them in the back. I'm still doing a ton of work there, but that's not something I can get Aura for. It's not like mobility weapons don't benefit from Aura. All the things that it gives you definitely still are things that mobility weapons want. I just don't think that it positively affects them as much as other aggros. Pair Aura with Cooler? What is holding these weapons back from single-handedly nuking the lobby for a whole match? You could easily go nearly an entire match with these buffs in effect between Cooler cycling and getting Aura from fighting all the time. Okay, but why does it really matter that mobility weapons are bad? Surely you can just play something else. If you cannot run mobility weapons in your movement shooter, it is a sign that there is something very wrong with your game's balance. Besides just the principle of it, mobility weapons are good for the game both as a player and a spectator. They're exciting to watch from a spectator POV because they have a lot of style and personality. They enable more interesting team playstyles, as long as the game is balanced to allow them to do so. Without mobility weapons, things can get really spammy. During 11.1, we were in the paint slop era, where teams would just have like 2 or 3 guys spamming paint while their blaster has enrichment time in their enclosure. But you also might get bomb or AoE or special spam without having a mobility weapon to create space for your team. And then most importantly, weapons with high skill expression should be rewarded for the effort that they require having put into them. Listen, it's not like mobility weapons are completely unplayable right now, it's just that the amount of effort required to put into them is completely disproportional to the payoff for that effort. You have to do so much work to get things done as a mobility weapon. Mechanically, you have to be completely locked in at all times just to win your fights. There's no indirect radius to compensate for missing your first shot, you're just cooked. You also have so much to account for in your decision making. Playing mobility weapons feels like playing 3D chess sometimes, because the value that you provide for your team often isn't as tangible or immediate as just straight up getting a kill is. You're not only controlling yourself, you're trying to control everyone else in the lobby with your actions. So much of your team's success comes down to your ability to pull some freaky shit off at the right time. And then you put in all this extra effort to make things happen, and you're still hardly rewarded for your effort, because these weapons are still not as strong as easier options, even if you could play them perfectly. I think some amount of feeling like you have to mech diff all the time is natural for weapons with higher skill expression, but you should get more payoff for your effort than easier options should. And it's not really like you can just swap onto another more viable weapon that's kinda similar to your main, because these problems affect every mobility weapon. I've seen so many V-Dually players swapping to Gal or Blaster or Zap, all of which play very differently than Dually because it's just not worth the effort that V-Dually, or any mobility weapon really, requires you to put in for it to be viable. So what needs to happen? Please just buff the fuck out of every mobility weapon. Genuinely make them busted. Everyone else has had a turn to be OP. Mom said it's our turn to be broken. I promise I have no bias here. I promise. No, but like seriously, I think you would have to give mobility weapons massive changes to make them actually as busted as current top tiers. So you could try a lot of stuff without being too concerned about accidentally making them broken. The best case scenario would be to find unique ways to buff them that encourage them to play to their mobility more instead of being stuck playing lame. Maybe making Incres stack for them better so that they stop getting one-shot by two-shot weapons because they stood an enemy Ink for a few seconds. I promise I'm not biased. Giving the Dually class built-in Incres to their rolls might be interesting, like how Ink Brush gets it when it rolls. I only play Dualies, so I mostly only have thoughts about Dualies in particular, but if you have ideas for creative buffs for other mobility weapons, no matter how viable it would realistically be, I'd be very interested to hear your ideas. Other than straight-up buffs to mobility weapons, a weapon's difficulty should be proportional to its strength. Keep low skill expression weapons mediocre, and lift up other high skill expression weapons, not just the mobility ones. I way preferred fighting S-Blast to Blaster because winning and losing those fights genuinely felt like it came down to who played it out better. When I win a fight versus a Blaster, I'm already on the verge of tears and about to home XA, and that's what I win! It doesn't even feel like I deserved it. Meanwhile, they barely have to know I exist to explode me with their mind. I am a tiny ant in their path. Was this secretly just a Blaster hit piece? Okay, that's all. You should watch my other stuff. Bye!